Hello there and welcome to another problem that we've got that we need to pseudocode and then we're going to program. So in part one of this video, we look at pseudocode in this problem, and then in part two, we're going to look at converting that pseudocode into Python. So here we've got sales directors of a company wish to compare the sales in thousands of pounds achieved by her staff in the previous month. It wants us to design an algorithm using pseudocode with the following inputs. So I've got two inputs here that I'm going to require, and the first one is the number of sales staff, and the next one is the sales figure for each member of staff. So if I enter 10 sales staff, it's going to get 10 figures entered in here. The algorithm should output the mean of the sales figures. So to calculate the mean, I'm going to have to work out the total of all of the sales and then divide that by how many sales I've actually how many sales staff there is. So that'll be number of staff in there. And then I need the values of the sales figures which are below the mean. So once I've calculated the mean, then I've got to look back through all the data that I've got to work out which figures are below the mean. And that will mean some kind of storage is needed. I have to store the data. Then I need to say how many sales figures are below the mean. So, is there one sales figure below the mean, or two, or maybe three, for example? I need to work that out. So I'm going to have to use some kind of count in order to work that out. And then the lowest sales figure out of the lot. So I need some kind of min calculation to work out the minimum. So a couple of things that the algorithm requires me to do, and then we've got some test data. So if somebody comes along and enters 6 for the number of staff that we've got, it's going to ask us to enter the sales data for 6 members of staff: 45, 55, 65, 65, 10, and 60. We add all them up, divide them by 6, and it gives us the mean of 50. In that list, 45 is below 50, and we have 10 is below 50. So we've got 45 and 10. How many sales figures are below the mean? 1 and 2, so we've got 2 sales figures below the mean, and our lowest sales figure of all of them is 10. And that's what we have to produce. So let's get stuck in then. So the first thing we need is 2 inputs from the user. So we need the number of sales staff. Firstly, I'll declare a variable. Now, if you're wondering why I've declared it as an integer, that's just me going off the test data. However, it does say in thousands of pounds. So you could have intuitively gone with a floating point value there, which is perfectly fine. It would work the same way. Then we look at the sales figure. So in order for me to actually get this, or get a value from the user for number of staff, I would say num staff, and we're going to have to set that variable, and we're going to require an input from the user. So we're expecting an input. There's the question we'll ask the user. They'll enter that in and it'll store in num staff. Perfectly fine. Just give that a tick to say I've done it. And now we need the sales figure for each member of staff. Now, to ask the same question a set number of times, I'm going to use a for loop. Now, I leave a gap here in case I'm going to need more variables later on. I might not do, but no harm in leaving a gap. For I equals 1 to num staff. Now think about this. I is equal to 1. On the next iteration, I is going to be 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6 if I was using this test data over here, and then it would stop. So when I say I is just a local variable in my for loop that allows me to store something, and it increments and goes up by 1 every time I finish the loop. So the next thing to do is ask the user to enter in some information. Now we've got to think here, in order for us to do the mean later on, we need to store the data. And the best data structure I could probably use for this, that goes really well with a for loop, is an array. So what I'm trying to picture is an array here of 6 elements in total. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now you might look at that and go, wait a second, if arrays start at 0 and I'm going up to 6, then that gives me 7 elements. If I use this for loop here and go I equals 1 up to numstaff, then this ignores the 0 box. It'll still be there, it'll still be declared in memory, however, I'm not using it. Some people would start at 0 here and go to numstaff minus 1, which lowers it down to 5, which is perfectly fine. You can do that. Now then, we're looking at my for loop and I go in here, I need to declare this structure. And I'll say my array, bracket, bracket, 6. What's it going to hold? Integers. And now that's declared this data structure here, that's called my array. So don't forget, arrays have identifiers, which is the name. They have indexes, which is its index location. And each one of these is called an element. One of these boxes here is called an element. So let's get using it then. Let's use it for storing our numbers. I would say my array at the position of I is given the value of an input from the user. And I'm going to ask them to enter. So it says enter the sales data for staff member, comma, I, and that will say staff member 1, staff member 2, staff member 3, 4, 5, and 6, because I is holding a number. And it puts it in my array at the position of I, so it'll be 1 in the first one, which is this element here, then it'll increment to 2 on the next pass, and 3, then 4, and 5, and 6, hopefully. So once this iteration finishes, it will have populated the entire list. Now, every time I come through this, I need to basically add up a total. So I'll declare a total variable. Total is integer. And I'll say total, which is default value is 0 currently, is given the value of total again, so whatever's stored in there, and add on whatever you've just put inside my array at the position of I. And that will add up each number as you go. Done that. And now what we need to do is allow that to add up, but we also need to do the lowest sales figure. And I can do that as data is coming in to my array. But I do need a variable for it. So I'll declare another variable and I'll call it min is integer. Now I need this value. If you think about what min holds a default value of 0. And if I come along and say, if the thing that you've just entered, which is my array at the position of I, so that's the element I've just populated, if that is less than my minimum value, then you're going to set the minimum value to equal my array I. Now think about that for a second, because if the min is 0 and I put in my first piece of data, so I'll go over to my test data here, 45, is 45 less than the minimum value, which is 0? No, it's not. Is 55 less than 0? No. Is 65 or 65 less than 0? No. Is 10 less than 0? No. And is 60 less than 0? No. So it would never trigger, because nothing in my list of test data is ever less than a minimum value. So what we need to do is we need to initialize set min is integer, and we're going to put up a really large number. And you'll see this used in the exam. So now, on the first number, it's going to set 45 to the minimum value, and then it'll compare 55 to 45, 65, 65, 10, and 60 to 45, and it'll get lowered. So that's the minimum value working. End my if statement. Close my loop. I don't think I need to do anything inside my loop anymore. data goes in on this line, the total gets added up, and then I use the min if statement there to calculate the minimum. Now outside of here, I'm going to need another variable, mean is, and I'll give it a value of float because the mean can be a floating point number, and I'll calculate the mean. Mean equals total divided by the number of staff. And that'll calculate the mean. So now we need to know the sales figures which are below the mean. And we also need to know how many sales figures are below the mean. So to do this, I'm going to need exactly the same structure again. I'm going to have to go back through my data. So I'll say for I equals 1 to num staff. And then I'm going to say if whatever's in my array is less than the mean, output value below mean, my array I. And that'll output the condition if we meet the if statement, and that'll get outputted there. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't count up how many values are below the mean. And for that, we're going to need another variable. Count is integer. Every time we trigger an element that's below the mean, we're going to say count equals count plus 1. So we just keep adding up 1 every time we actually find one below the mean. And we'll end the if statement there. And we'll increment the for loop. Next I. So we've got one for loop here, one for loop here, the mean calculation in the middle, and the only thing that we need to do now is output the data as shown here. So what I'll do is I'll just follow my line over here. I thought I'd have more space, but I don't. I just need to output everything. So I'll use my outputs now to output the mean. Now it needs to be a suitable message, so always concatenate it with a string, and I'll say output mean is speech mark, comma to concatenate, and there's my variable mean. Close my bracket. Output speech mark, values below the mean. Well, that already gets outputted there. So then I'll go the total number of values below the mean. So total, concatenate that we count, total number of values below the mean, comma count. Then we need the lowest sales figure, which I think are stored in min. So output, lowest sales figure, concatenate it with min. So I've done all of those now, happy with that. I've got the lowest sales figure, I've got the mean, I've got the sales below the mean, and I've got the mean itself. I've taken the inputs, I've stored it, I've looped through my array, and that's it for 6 marks. So if you're unsure about any of those steps, in the next video we're going to convert this into Python so that we can have a look exactly how this works. Now, guaranteed you might not have got your head around this, so go back and have a look at how I explain each part of the step. Part of the battle of these pseudocode problems is just getting your head around what we're doing step by step and problem solving. So join me in the next video where we're going to program this pseudocode.